Good afternoon to everyone. Mania and I worked on this presentation and hopefully we'll be able to both unpack and demystify what is South-South cooperation. Now, in no stretch of imagination, I can't say this duckling is ugly. No? Sumitra said it's a sweet duckling. And if you have noticed, the first title that I proposed was from duckling to swan. I didn't sort of, attach any adjective, whether it is ugly or beautiful. So, I think the duckling is well said. What we'll do in this half an hour, 40-minute presentation is to talk basic about South-South cooperation. I know a couple of our colleagues are working on this issue, South-South cooperation, but I also know that a lot of us haven't paid much attention to this part of PRIA's work. So from concept to the advocacy that we have been involved in, I'll try to sort of take you through the journey. But let me start with the very basic of it. When we say South-South, let us understand soon what is happening. Okay. What is South? Any insights on what is South? Let me help.
South of what?
South of southern part of the world. And what is southern part? Southern hemisphere. But that is true. But if you look at this line, it's practically what represents the countries to the south of this line represents southern countries. Of course, there will be a north, and that's why it's a relative positioning. Now, how do we characterize the south? If you look at this, here you have Latin America, Mexico, beach way, Africa, the blue, part of blue is Asia, including Central Asia. And there is purple one, is that purple?
Yeah.
So that's Australia. So if you look at these countries, then how do we characterize these countries? South?
South, west and southeast.
Okay. What else?
Darker shade of skin.
Darker shade of skin. Okay. What else?
Somebody said
Post-colonial nation.
Post-colonial nation. Excellent. What else?
Countries that won warring in the world war, the world part of the Cold War, basically.
Okay. Well, almost all countries were part of the Cold War.
As a part of the colony, but it was the war was basically, the Cold War was between the USSR and the NATO countries. The details that NATO and USSR are these countries. Typically, the more developing economies follow the South-South region.
Correct. What else?
Quote unquote underdeveloped.
Quote unquote underdeveloped.
Young
Underdeveloped,
markets.
developing, colonized.
Young markets.
Young markets. Yeah.
Almost similar kind of development challenges.
Right. So historically speaking, once all of these countries were resource rich, right? They had enormous amount of natural resources. look at the forest or land or water or even mineral resources, enormous amount of resources. They all have old civilizations, from Inca to Maya to Indus. Every continent represents one of the other bigger civilization, much before what appeared to be truth in case of Europe or North America. Of course, they were then colonized, and part of the reasons of colonization was because of this resource richness. But what happened after colonizations? Low economic development, low human development, and weak institutional capacities. And that's how we define southern, developing, underdeveloped. We use multiple expressions to lesser access to technology. Much of South has experienced historically a lot of conflicts, and that is also somehow linked to the colonized rulers, colonizing rulers. And then in modern day, we also see high inequality, whether it is economic inequalities or access to certain resources. Before we talk about South-South cooperation and what South does today, we might not be understanding it fully unless we also look at how North did understood development. So I'll take you through a short history lessons very quickly, that how did it happen. 1942. What is the significance of 1942? Declaration of United Nations. But what is the point of history? World War II is still going on. It ended in 45. From 39 to 45. And it was, it in a way sort of devastated Europe. Not only Europe, but also the European countries which colonized the other parts, Africa, particularly North Africa, part of Asia, and part of Latin America. So the idea was that we end war, but we also bring in greater amount of economic and developmental cooperation. And there, the North America and the Europeans, they took the lead. 1944. Emergence of Bretton Woods institution. What is Bretton Woods institution? World Bank, IMF. And why it's called Bretton Woods? It's a place in the US, Northern Hampshire. And there, again, the idea was to take responsibilities to reconstruct primarily the Europe, but also, as I said, the World War II in a way ravaged a large part of the world, and therefore reconstruction of, redesigning of the economic cooperation, industrial development, etc. So these two institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, they took the responsibility. And they started coordinating the cooperation between countries in that sense. In 1960, there was the establishment of OECD DAC, Organizations for Economic Cooperation and Development. And within OECD, there is this special committee called Development Assistance Committee. It was established. And while economic cooperation was going on through or mediated through IMF and the World Bank, and the political negotiations were going through the United Nations, but the actual development cooperation was facilitated by the OECD countries. And right now there are almost like 35 OECD countries, which are primarily Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. There are 2 countries in Asia are the members of OECD, South Korea and Japan. So these are developed economy, those who thought that we have a historical responsibility for the reconstruction of or redevelopment of the world, particularly focusing on the developing or underdeveloped or least developed countries. Then 1970 becomes an important milestone in the North Lake Development Cooperation, where the OECD agreed to, these are donor countries, they agreed to that 0.7% of their total GNI will be spent on development cooperation. So that's a significant consensus among the OECD countries, and out of 35 OECD countries, only so far 6, 7 have become sort of, have followed that, in fact. So it was more like an aspirational figure that we must contribute this much amount in the development cooperation. And then in 1980, it became another milestone in a very different way. The whole of Latin America and part of Africa and also Asia, but mostly the Latin America, most countries experienced what they call debt crisis, which means for their own development, the loan or the debts that they serviced, for taking loan from the IMF or from the World Bank or from other OECD countries, there was an estimation that even to service $1 debt, they had to pay $2. So that was the nature of development cooperation, which in a way became a debt trap for most of the countries. Now, as it happens, most of the powerful constellations like World Bank or OECD or UN, they would not take responsibility. They would say that it's you where the problem lies. And then this suggested a structural adjustment program, which means you have to change your governance, administration, fiscal governance, and there's a major focus on anti-corruption. So the whole narrative was that you have mismanaged your economy and therefore you are responsible, and we are here to tell you how to fix it. And all the prescriptions came through structural adjustment program. In a second, we'll take a look at what are the focus of structural adjustment program. So it talked about reforming the macroeconomic parameters of a country, and currency devaluation, devaluation, and austerity. Nowadays we see and hear austerity, but it was there in 1980s. So reduce expenses. Then one of the suggestions was to reduce subsidy for everything. Whether it is food subsidy, whether it's transport subsidy, fuel subsidy. So, and these became a precondition, what we often refer in the development cooperation language, economic conditionality and political conditionality. So these became part of this, next round of support. Wages, increasing public service tariffs. So earlier, most of the states have had a welfareist way of looking at or managing development. But there was prescription that market need to be liberalized. A lot of privatization need to happen because money is there, and then the capital flow will come, and disinvestment. Wherever government is in business, it must be disinvested. And then reforming governance and anti-corruption measures. In today's context, all these really do not sound very dramatical. Now, all of these things are happening And if it does not happen, then we think that reform is not happening, right? If you look at the current narrative, that if privatization doesn't happen, if market is not liberalized, but in 1980s, it was too radical. And most of the developing countries were not in a position or not prepared to undertake this kind of reform. And the very definition of underdevelopment, the very definition that they were developing countries, which means a substantive number of people were living below the poverty line. And they didn't have the capacity to participate in a market-oriented economy, where they had to depend on the public policies and public measures, right? So, in a way, in 1990, the counter-narrative started coming in, primarily from the United Nations, and UNDP took a lead, where the development narrative became more than economic development. You also need to bring in human development. So the first time in 1990, you have heard about Human Development Index. The first report came in 1990, and it talked about various dimensions, and particularly the health, education, livelihood. These are the aspects which were emphasized in a way to counterbalance the force of World Bank and the IMF. We are lucky, in a sense. We may do a lot of critique about 5 years plan, but all those countries which were then getting independence, very few of them had any national development plan. In that way, the then leaders were quite visionary. We may have a political discourse on that, we may have a political debate around that, but unlike India, most of the African countries didn't have any nationally owned national development plan. So therefore there was no blueprint that how to develop, how to tackle poverty, how to tackle the economic development. So then World Bank came up with what they call poverty reduction strategy, PRS. And poverty reduction strategy, in a way, a shadow development, let's say blueprint to support the national development of those countries. There was also a kind of leadership change within the World Bank, and therefore, and the new leadership brought in the human face in the development process. So earlier, the focus was more on economic development, infrastructure development, and the whole narrative was top-down, trickle-down approach to development. But for the first time, both Human Development Index and related discourses, as well as the poverty reduction strategy discourses, focused on poverty reduction and development. There is also a critique that once you have created havoc and now you are trying to sort of respond to what you call lepatopathy, or you are just applying balm on a kind of deep wound that has already been created through structural adjustment program, and by the time it has created a lot of dependence on the North-led development, and the critique still prevails now. In 2000, you all are familiar with Millennium Development Goal, and the idea was that all the donors, particularly the OECD countries, they in a way sort of legitimize it through the UN leadership, and that's why it's called UN Millennium Development Goal. But the effort primarily came from the OECD DAC countries, and therefore all the developing countries or countries in the south, they became recipient of the prescription by the UN Millennium Development Goal. And that's fundamentally different what happened this time in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed upon. Right? So there were 8 goals, primarily health, education, poverty reduction, various other goals. And then in 2005, there was a declaration primarily by the OECD DAC countries, which is known as Paris Declaration. And Paris Declaration is in a way it talks about ownership, alignment, harmonization, mutual accountability and results. I'll sort of explain it. Most of the donors, let's say DFID or NORAD from Norwegian donors, or Danida, the Danish donor, Australian aid or French aid, all these OECD, the European countries, or let's say USAID or Canadian CEDA or Swedish CEDA, they have their own program. And normal channel of development assistance was a bilateral arrangement with the developing country, a particular developing country. So let's say, take example of India. DFID will have a bilateral agreement with the government of India, and government of India will say, we need this, and DFID will, okay, but we don't have all of this, but from our strategy point of view, these things are important, and I think that you should be doing this. So that's the kind of nature of dialogue with the donors. So similarly, similar negotiation will happen with the CEDA, with Canadian CEDA, with NORAD. So an individual country had to deal with 35 donors, and each donor has its own practices, whether it is accounting of aid, whether it is the modalities of aid, or the priorities of aid, and how those priorities are determined. So everyone had their own way. But it was really a havoc for any small countries. India is a kind of outlier in that sense. But think about a small country in Africa had to deal with 20 donors, 25 donors, and with different departments with no coordination. The transaction cost was huge. And in fact, there was a study that 30 to 35% of the development aid was going in this transaction. So actual money, which was meant for the poor, that didn't arrive at all. Right? So in a way, Paris Declaration was, I would say, a decent and honest acknowledgement that we messed up. We messed up, and therefore we need to clarify certain things and come up with some principles which would guide our future. So the ownership here means the national ownership. As I was trying to explain when we are talking about PRS, poverty reduction strategy, now initially it was externally facilitated by the World Bank, but gradually in 2-3 rounds there was tremendous pressure on the World Bank that it must be owned by the national government, and therefore national government, which is preferably democratically elected government, would decide what are the national priorities. And from that point of view, the ownership of the national government about the development priorities were emphasized in Paris Declaration. Alignment was basically to reduce the transaction cost. Both harmonization and alignment, they were taken together. That when we decide to support one country, then let's talk that who supports what. That's basically a coordination amongst the OECD donors, and then mutual accountability. Earlier, an accountability particularly for results of development, the impact of the development cooperation, impact of the investment, as if the accountability lie only with the recipient government and the recipient community. And there was no as such accountability with the donor government. So the discourse came that it's not only, if you have created mess, we are responsible, you are also responsible. And in order to clean up that mess, we better be mutually accountable. So that's the narrative in Paris Declaration. Now, what had happened that, in 2000, early 2000, even before the Paris Declaration, when it started in 80, but it sort of took currency in early 90s or late 80s, the focus on governance and focus on democracy. And by the time, if you recall history, that USSR broke down, right? The wall between two Germanys broke down, right? And therefore, there was a new discourse on and a kind of a narrative that a democratic country is in a better position to manage development more equitably and more equal. So that's the kind of narrative and hypothesis. And a whole lot of Latin American countries and African countries, although they got independence, but they quickly fall into trap of authoritarian regime. And therefore, there are extreme inequalities in those countries. There are a couple of sort of benevolent authoritarian rulers, but most of them indulge in corruption, personal gain, and therefore they actually messed up their own economy. And therefore, a major focus was on anti-corruption, bringing democracy, and part of the democracy per se was also emergence of civil society. And the language of civil society came along with governance and democracy. So democratic governance, civil society, these were part of the package. And many a times, when you hear about the conditionalities, you may like some part of it being part of civil society and being sort of an advocate of civil society space, but part of the conditionalities was also very harsh, which is sort of related to economics. So I just wanted to put it in balance that you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you have to take certain harsh things in order to get certain good things in that sense. So let's come back to the earlier slide. And then in 2011, what happened then? It was an important milestone. There's a Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Now earlier, till the time of Paris Declaration, what is the language? What is the language?
Mutual accountability.
No, Paris Declaration on
Aid effectiveness.
and what is the language in Busan?
Development
Cooperation, right? Effectiveness, but in development cooperation. It's a tremendous shift, even in the mindset and narrative. That earlier it was a donor-donee aid relationship, and in 2011, for the first time, there was recognition, even in the language and narrative, that it's development cooperation, it's not aid cooperation. So aid is only a part of it, but the development cooperation is much bigger than that. And one important thing happened in 2011, Busan Conference. And again, the Busan Conference was predominantly a OECD DAC affair. It had nothing to do with UN per se. So it was a kind of 35 countries, rich country club, who decided how this effective development cooperation will be defined and what will be the relationship. But then one good thing happened in 2011 Busan Partnership. It did not happen exactly in the Busan Declaration, but 2 years after that, when it was being reviewed, one is acknowledgement of the emerging economies and their role in the development cooperation. And that is, by that time, India, Brazil, China, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, Argentina, all these countries have had enormous and substantive economic growth. And they also had enormous influence on the political processes in globally speaking, right? Even they had major say in the UN processes. And by that time, in 2009, India, Brazil, South Africa, and China and Russia, they came up with the idea of BRICS. First BRIC, then BRICS. So in a way, historically, if you see, you have one club of rich and there is a club of the non-rich. So they started sort of in a way countering and producing sort of counter narrative what OECD was trying to do. So the development cooperation remained at the centerpiece, but the way the BRICS countries tried to look at development cooperation and the way OECD countries tried to look at the development cooperation, there's a narrative and counter narrative. So in 2011, there was an acknowledgement of South-South cooperation. And practically it happened in 2013, but between 2011 and 13, a lot of discourses started acknowledging the role of South-South cooperation. And then in 2015, we came up with Sustainable Development Goal. And unlike MDGs, in SDGs, it's universal, which means the developing country, underdeveloped country, least developed country, and developed country, all these goals need to be achieved, right? It's not targeted to a few countries. It is universal. So it's a major shift. It's a major shift that you are not targeted, but you are part of a larger global goals. And then in Addis Ababa, there was a discussion on what's called financing for development, FFD. Now, in order to implement SDGs, where will the resources come? You need resources to achieve those goals, but where those resources will come from. And obviously, if you look at, by that time, particularly from 2008 onwards, when the financial crisis started in the US, first in Europe and then in the US, a lot of developed countries, 0% was considered to be a fair amount of, economic growth. It's not minus. Whereas there is considerable discourse on that, whether we grew at 7% or 12%. But all the other emerging economies, they were growing minimum 5% and then maximum 12%, like China. And that growth was consistent. So there was kind of emerging economy, which then the expectation was that they would also take responsibilities for the implementation of sustainable development goals, right? So somewhat sort of equalities in the SDG and the following sort of resourcing of SDG, that understanding came. So let's move. Talking about South-South cooperation. In South-South cooperation, as I said, that we might not understand the complexities of South-South cooperation, the diversity of South-South cooperation, unless we had also taken a look at what is not South cooperation. So it's a counter narrative, and practically it is cooperation between developing countries. Right? This is as simple as that. And 4 milestones, in a way, define the current nature of South-South cooperation. The first started in 1955 with what we call Bandung Conference. Where is Bandung, by the way? Indonesia. And Indonesia just got its independence from the Dutch. Yes. So, and then sort of the first president of Indonesia, Soekarno. Soekarno took the lead to bring in, let's say, those countries, and there was kind of huge tension between China and the US. And by that time, post World War II, Cold War stage already sort of in a way set in. And there was, even when the Bretton Woods Institutes or OECD, all those things were coming in, the Americans were pretty much sure that in the US, Stalin is not interested in building the Western Europe per se. But Stalin was more interested in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, that part of the Eastern Europe part of it. So there's a tension. On one hand, the USSR led communist ideology and socialist economy, and on the other hand, capitalist democratic push from the Europe and the US. And there was in between these countries, which are the 29 countries participated in Bandung conference, and all of them were newly independent countries, and they were trying to figure out a meaning between communism and social, and capitalism, right? And even if you look at in our own economic documents, at that point in time, we came up with a mixed economy. Idhar ka bhi, udhar ka bhi, na idhar. So somehow striking a balance between these two schools of thought. And then in 1978, but it was primarily seen as an Africa-Asia conference. So it's that these 29 countries primarily came from Asia and Africa. That was the first Afro-Asian conference. But in BAPA is Buenos Aires Plan of Action. Buenos Aires, where is it? Argentina. It's the capital of Argentina. But this BAPA process was facilitated by the United Nations. By that time, the South-South Cooperation Office was also established at about the same time. I think it came in 77 or early part of 78. So they facilitated this conference, and that's how it included African, Asian, and also the Latin American countries. And then in 2009, as Nairobi, there was a huge conference again by the facilitated by the UN, but a major role was played by Nigeria, Kenya, India, Brazil, and then Nairobi became a major milestone for defining what is South-South cooperation and also taking stock of what has been achieved. And then finally in 2013, there was a conference in New Delhi. And all these four events in a way define the shape, modalities, instruments for South-South cooperation. Very quickly, what happened in Bandung? These were the principles. And remember again, those are the emerging economies. They are conflict-ridden. There are a lot of human rights abuses as part of that independence struggle. So the Bandung principle came up with respect for human rights and respect for sovereignty. And in my earlier slide, you have read what Jawaharlal Nehru has been saying. So equality, non-interference, mutual interest and collaboration, and international justice. So the whole idea was to be fair on ourselves, but also to be seen fair in the world affairs. Then some additional principles came from Buenos Aires is self-reliance, that we don't want to be dependent on the northern resources and northern countries. But the argument was that North has a historical responsibility, because a lot of prosperity what we see in North is at the cost of southern resources. So there was a historical burden and not burden. It was a historical responsibility on part of the northern countries. So the additional principles came as capacity development, knowledge transfer, and economic independence. Key principles from Nairobi was again, if you look at the governance of the United Nations structures, its agencies, special agencies, or the main bodies, including the Security Council. If you look at the governance of the World Bank, if you see the governance of IMF, these have always been dominated by the northern countries, and primarily a division of responsibilities were divided between Europe and North America, right? An Asian phase does not mean that it was a transfer of or acknowledgement of Asian power. That Asian phase was primarily an American citizen, right? So the qualification was, where are you coming from? Are you a citizen of the Europe, or are you a citizen of the North America? That would define the governance or leadership of these institutions. So in a way, I would suggest that the new clubs, whether it is India, Brazil, South Africa, IPSA, or BRICS, Brazil, India, South Africa, China, and Russia, or SCO, let's say this, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All these are in a way a reaction towards the capturing of or power capturing by the North America and the Europe vis-a-vis the governance of these global governance institutions, right? The regional cooperations were always there. Unfortunately, South Asia has not been able to do much through the regional or sub-regional cooperation, because SAARC has always been a victim of the relationship between India and Pakistan, and therefore it has not been able to do much. But if you look at the Asian community, the Southeast Asia, North Asia, they have done excellently well. If you look at Mercosur in Latin America, they have done exceedingly well. The regional economies were always connected in that sense. But this geopolitical thing, think about India, Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa. It's like intercontinental executive club. So these are in a way sort of reaction towards that. But also an attempt to express their solidarity, but also exert influence on the global governance process. And therefore, there was an emphasis on multilateralism. That yes, the multilateral institutions like UN, World Bank, they are not doing so well in terms of having a representative structure in their governance, but it is also our institution. So reclaiming that position was a major proclamation from Nairobi, which was also in a way sort of re-emphasized in New Delhi conference. A lot of development cooperation between southern countries, and I will come to this in more detail, does not account that how much money or there are sort of challenges associated with that. And therefore, the principle was that we need to be transparent, we need to be accountable to what we do. We cannot be, unaccountable to, even if we talk about mutual collaboration or mutual gain, we have to be accountable. Then again, national ownership, independence, and non-conditionality. Again, it was a reaction towards that, all those political and economic conditionalities that was imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. And therefore, when you talk to the South-South cooperation practitioners, particularly the government representatives, they would react very sharply. The moment you talk about conditionality, They'll sort of give so much of counter narrative about. So it's a very sensitive issue for India. It's a very sensitive issue for many Latin American countries because the conditionality. India still resisted to some extent from 1980s to our economic reform started practically in 1991, 1992. When a lot of bad things were also happening in the economy, they were also in that. But it resisted for almost 1 decade. But don't remember that twice IMF rejected India's application for loan. It was so in a way, what should I say? It's not a matter of pride for the Indian government, but the economy was so bad, doing so bad. So this non-conditionality becomes very important principle in South-South cooperation. Then inclusivity and participation, of course, in Africa we can't talk about without inclusivity or participation. And remember the discussion was in Nairobi. And then results, impact and quality. These are sort of emphases that South-South cooperation should have. And in a way sort of all other historical processes and the discussions were in a way consolidated in the New Delhi conference, and we are very good at that. So in New Delhi, I mean there were sort of 9 or 10 principles that were sort of articulated, but what stand today are the ones which are on board. Demand driven, and it's kind of voluntary, so nobody is coercing someone to chalo bhai cooperate kar le. No, so it's demand driven, that if you need something you articulate it, and then we create a process or we design a process through which this demand can be processed. We have several questions about that, but still, it's an important principle that it's not imposed upon, it's demand driven, it's not imposed upon, it's voluntary. So that's one principle. Then national ownership and independence. Everything that is decided by you will find a process or means to support that. So it's not that what we think that would be good for you. Non-conditionality and respect for national sovereignty. Again, it's an important principle, and therefore there's a kind of prevalent narrative. One of the reasons why government of India or many of the southern governments will not work on political issues or democracy issues or human rights issues, but many a times these are seen as interfering with the political processes within the country. So anyone commenting on Kashmir or anyone commenting on Northeast or anyone commenting on Balochistan would be seen as sort of interfering, meddling with the national sovereignty, right? So therefore, this is an important aspects of South cooperation. Good, bad, I'm not saying, but this is an important principle. Mutual benefit, of course, it's not aid. It's not aid. Even Government of India's language, you won't find they don't say aid or they don't say donor. It's always a development cooperation, and there's a bit of cliche to that, but the language is important. And then there's a set of tools. A set of tools being applied to put South-South cooperation in practice. We'll talk about that, but it's diverse. So it's not a single tool which is used, but a diversity of tools are used in development cooperation. And there was also a realization. I think I would call it's coming of age. Earlier, the South-South cooperation was almost seen, and particularly with the money power that China has. It's almost replacing North-South cooperation and coming everything against North-South cooperation. But of late there is an acknowledgement that there are a lot of things which we can learn in 2 ways. One, what we should not be doing at all. and what what good practices we can learn from North-South. And particularly in the context of SDG, there was also an understanding and acknowledgement that South-South cooperation can complement North-South cooperation, not replace the North-South cooperation. So that is an important principle. Nevertheless, I think in today's context, these are sort of 5-6 principles which have become almost like a kind of guiding principles in all the South-South cooperation principles. Now, I'll just take a few minutes to demystify certain terminologies. Well, let's start with the IDC, International Development Cooperation. And many times you will see this word called ODA, Official Development Assistance. So, ODA is one tool within the whole gamut of international development cooperation, or let's say international cooperation, right? And ODA is defined as close to developing countries and multilateral institutions, because many times these bilateral donors, they put in resources in the country, but they also put in resources multilateral institutions like World Bank or IMF or UN agencies or other financial institutions, IFIs, through which the money goes, right? So when World Bank operates in a country, so they don't have their own money, they have money from other governments. So it's an intergovernmental agency. Every government puts in resources. Obviously, those who put much bigger resources might have a bigger say. So the ODA is defined as, and the most important part of it, it's concessional in character and contains a grant element of at least 25%. So that's the definition, agreed upon definition of ODA by OECD DAC, and that definition was taken in 1972. On the other hand, you have South-South cooperation, and I'm saying this because there is also a sensitivity attached to even what you say. Is this South-South cooperation or is this South-South development cooperation, right? So, for example, India sending peacekeeping forces or sending military forces for handling natural disaster. So are they South-South cooperation or South-South development cooperation? It has very little to do directly with the development cooperation, but it is part of the South-South cooperation. And now, in order to, from the government sort of perspective, in order to show a bigger sort of chunk of contribution, they always prefer to talk about South-South cooperation as opposed to only South-South development cooperation. And that is also true in case of ODA. But in today's context, there are also overlaps. There are also overlaps. In a sense, many of these countries, the southern countries, they are also using ODA and what is called triangular cooperation. Triangular cooperation, samajh rahe hain, triangular. So there has to be maybe there is a provider country, resource provider, there is a technology provider, and then there is a recipient country. But they don't call it recipient country, they call it pivotal country, right? So there the work is done. So this triangular cooperation is a combination of both ODA and part of the resources coming from SDC or SSDC or SSC. Now these are some of the instruments, like it starts with grants, of course, a small component is grant, and I'll explain on that. And then loan is one instrument, and then another is credit line. What is the difference between loan and credit line? In 2000, I took a loan from the bank for buying a house, and the house was already constructed, so I knew exactly how much money I need, and I took the loan at a time, and I paid interest in EMIs. But then last month I took a loan from the bank for my daughter's education. And bank sanctioned me some lakh of rupees. But I don't take that lakh of rupees now. I took a part of it. And whenever it is required, I will take that loan. So this loan is called line of credit, which is open. It is given to you. You draw money, and in certain line of credits, it is also replenished. It is also replenished. So India giving, let's say, $100 million loan is loan, which means 100 million upfront. But 100 million line of credit to Bangladesh to construct what? The bridge, let's say, railway infrastructure. So Bangladesh government will draw on that resources, and when the 100 million is sort of consumed, then Bangladesh government can ask that, can you expand this line of credit? So then Indian government will replenish another 100 million. And one is of course trade and investment. And trade and investment, we understand, we do business with other countries, and primarily it is driven by business to business, private sector to private sector. So trade. Then technical cooperation. We know something which we can offer others. Then budget support. The Indian government does not do much of this budget support, but other government like Brazil has this practice, Argentina has this practice, even some of the South Africa has this practice of giving, let's say, I will support 20% of your educational budget. So that's called budget support. So you have a national budget in place, and then 20% or 15% or agriculture budget will budget support. That is also part of this tool. Then Government of India does this through its iTech program, scholarship, providing scholarship. It's a hugely popular tool through. Then public-private partnership. The great example is the Pan-Africa IT project, and building on that project, it was an excellent example where the IT infrastructure was provided by the Indian IT giants, but the negotiations and all those things, initial investments were done by Indian government, but they also partner with the local IT firms, and then it has expanded to include medical service. For example, large part of Africa is inaccessible, and where the health services are not available. So it's a kind of distantly located health center which is connected through IT, and the doctors or the specialized doctor is sitting in a district headquarter or the state headquarter. They send the prescription or the examination result, and the specialists provide that support through IT. Yeah? So it's a hugely successful example of South-South cooperation in the context of public-private partnership. And there are many more examples of doing this kind of work. As I said that many a times South-South cooperation money has also been used for debt relief or debt cancellation. For example, if a country has taken loan from the World Bank and they are unable to provide or service that loan, many southern countries have also come in and provided. China does this very often. But it's also like Bangladesh took a loan from India, and they sort of in a way expressed their inability to repay back. So Government of India cancelled that, or sort of relieved that part of the loan. And then we have in kind. I remember Government of India immediately after the post-Taliban regime, Government of India sent one of the aircrafts which became part of the national aircraft in Afghanistan. And so this is in kind. So something we have, we don't need, or it's not up to the mark, but still you can use. It's almost like that kind of arrangement. And this is these are various tools, and collectively, sometimes it's called development compact. And the beauty of it is that it does not, it often use a combination of. So line of credit might have a capacity building component where technical cooperation comes in. So it will come together as a package. And part of it could also be a grant, let's say 5% or 10% grant. And what happens that because line of credit operates through an instrument, in case of India, what is called Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank. So Exim Bank draws money from the open market, let's say in 4% interest. But then Government of India will give certain money to Exim Bank to reduce the loan when they offer it to the to other countries. So the recipient country will receive it in 2% interest. So that 2% is accounted as grants. So they receive concessional loan, but the same loan is taken by a higher rate by the Exim Bank. So that's the kind of instrument of that. Well, what could be the reasons for ascendancy in South-South cooperation? Of course, you can't help others unless you are also a bit more capable. So, of course, a growing and robust economy, particularly in China, India, all other countries. And there is increased volume of trade and investment, both inflow of resources and outflow of outgoing trade. Between countries there could be certain trade deficits, but there is a better business between countries. And all of these countries have acquired a critical capacities, particularly economies, but also strategic military power. And also soft power. IT is one example, or the education or intellectual or technical capacities. These are part of soft power. And then, as we have been discussing about growing influence on global institutions and the global politics, through these instruments like IPSA, G20, SCO, and this point is very interesting from our perspective. Is the stronger incentive for seeking solution that we still have, let's say, give and take, 1/4 of our population is under property, and we have been dealing with this. And there are important and meaningful experimentation in our country. So how did we deal with poverty and development? So that's a learning that could be very relevant to Africa as opposed to learning from the UK. So therefore, the countries which are in a similar situation and come up with certain solutions, very homegrown solution, though there is a kind of learning appetite there. So therefore, SSC is not only about transferring resources, but also transferring knowledge resources, not technical resources. And then, of course, achieving SDGs would require the contribution from developing countries or emerging economies. Some critics. One is many a times, it's true that it does not have a framework. It does not, unlike OECD, which has sort of developed over 50-60 years, a robust framework for development cooperation. It does not have a framework, and the characteristic is that it's diverse. That's the beauty of it, but often the diversity cannot be captured within a single framework, and therefore it doesn't happen. It lacks, rigorous mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation. By thumb rule, OECD countries spend almost like 10 to 15% of their resources in monitoring and evaluation. We spend very little. South-South cooperation does spend very little on monitoring and evaluation. And there is also, it's also true for not South cooperation, but South-South cooperation is often, housed within the Ministry of External Affairs, and therefore many a times it's driven by the foreign policy objectives, as opposed to well, there would be a sense of solidarity and language of solidarity, but what is my interest in giving money to this country or that country? So like foreign policy objective is also. And then, there is often a critique that it doesn't make any distinction between a democratic country or whether it's a non-democratic country, because we don't believe in conditionalities, whether it is democratic or not, which may be in a way good, that ultimately the money would go to the people of that country. That country as a sort of political system is undemocratic, but not necessarily people are undemocratic, right? So from that perspective, it's okay, but at the same time it does not put any kind of obligation on part of the partner government to behave democratically, right? So that's another critique. Often it's kind of ambiguous about non-tied aid, and there's a huge critique about the ODA, because a lot of ODA was tied to many things, and therefore the counter narrative from SSC was that we want to untie our resources. But what has happened that when a line of credit is operational, then the condition is that 75% of the services and goods need to be procured from India or Indian companies. So what do you call it? It's a conditionality, right? So even if we do a kind of bus project in Bangladesh, the Bangladesh should buy buses from Ashok Leyland or from Tata. The 75%, and 25% out of that, maybe 10% is capacity building, and then PRIA would be called to do that capacity building. So that's again Indian organization. So that conditionality is also there. But the counter narrative, the way sort of government version of it, this is mutual benefit. Why should I give money to Bangladesh if I don't get benefit out of it? Which is unfair. And of course, transparency and accountability seem to be weak because they don't have. And this is where we come in. The current South-South cooperation narrative is dominated by the government to government or business to business. So it's between Bangladesh government or Nepal government or Sri Lankan government and Indian government, or between Kirloskar and another company, similar company in Bangladesh, or maybe Tata and another company. Therefore, the civil society to civil society engagement, people to people engagement does not necessarily sort of come within the framework very easily within South-South cooperation. And we have been arguing, and that's where PRIA's role in understanding South-South cooperation and what we do in South-South cooperation. Our argument is that civil society organizations in India have enormous capacity. They have technical understanding, they have political understanding, they have the sensitivity about participation, democracy, and this could be a tremendous asset in adding value to South-South cooperation, what government is trying to do or the private sector is trying to do. And therefore, of course, there is sort of resistance from the government, and a lot of this resistance comes with the political dispensation, but there is sort of inherent inertia on part of the government that even when we started discussing with some of the joint secretaries in MEA, they would say, look, we don't want to go to public. We say, why? So they said that how do we politically sell this argument that 25% of our people are under poverty and we are giving money to another country. It's sort of politically somewhat unviable or sort of unpalatable for people. So we want to underplay whatever development cooperation we do. But then sort of that understanding has changed over a period of time, and now practically there is now boldness and confidence that yes, we are doing this and we are doing for our. So one of the challenges of South-South cooperation, as I was trying to explain, that no consistent definition of SSC. What is SSC? There is a kind of benchmark, but there is no definition per se. And it may vary from India to Nepal to China, what constitutes South-South cooperation. And that in a way sort of influences not having an accounting procedure. So when you say that OECD grants 0.7%, we can't say whether it is 0.7% or is 15% or it's 0%. We can't say with sort of that certainty because we don't know what constitutes South-South cooperation. Or whether it is, even if we come up with a definition, that may not be comparable with China's definition of South-South cooperation. They may include something else and therefore it's not comparable. And institutions which are carrying out, is totally fragmented. And this fragmentation, in order to sort of deal with this fragmentation in 2013, yes, the Ministry of External Affairs came up with one unit within the ministry called Development Partnership Administration. And there are sort of three parts of it. One part deals with capacity building, one part deals with line of credit, and one part deal with what is that? The third one?
Small grants.
Small grants, yeah, small grants. So there are sort of three parts in GPA. And they are trying to sort of now coordinate what agricultural department is doing, what science and technology is doing, what education department is doing, what SEWA is doing, what PRIA is doing. They are trying to sort of coordinate the totality of the development cooperation in one place, at least having some database Of course, the methodology related to data collection, analysis and reporting vis-a-vis the and because it involves quite a lot of technical cooperation and knowledge transfer, how do you sort of put value or monetary value to all of these? Many times that becomes a challenge. I'll sort of finish with this slide. One is how this argument that civil society has the capacity and they can contribute and they add value, they can add value to the South-South cooperation overall. There is a kind of global movement, but we are also trying to influence this discourse, narrative, and the policies in the government. And first of all, we have become part of it. In fact, PRIA is one of the founding members of a forum called Forum for India's Development Cooperation, FIDC. And FIDC is housed in one of the think tanks of the Ministry of External Affairs, called RIS. But the beauty of this forum is that it has membership from civil society, academia, and the representative from MEA. So we sort of occasionally sit together, discuss it. But FIDC has also expanded this discourse to build a constituency among the civil society. Even if you talk to civil society is also very fragmented. You say, why should we go and work outside India, and why India should go outside India? So that sentiment is also there. And therefore, we are trying to build a larger narrative, educating the civil society organizations that why it is important to pay attention to what government of India does and what SSC and how SSC should evolve. So CSO academia constituency building, and we are trying to sort of build a narrative which is sort of, from our perspective, it is civil society centric, but we are also trying to look at South-South cooperation in a much broader way. And one of the studies that we did was to document the civil society, Indian civil society organizations working outside and how they have sort of practiced development cooperation. We did another study to look at India-Bangladesh cooperation, particularly focusing on the line of credit, but we also tried to understand in the context of the South-South cooperation. So we are trying to build that knowledge and sharing that, disseminate that knowledge, and to develop that constituency. And then, of course, convening various dialogues across the country, but also participating in these regional and global dialogues. That is how PRIA is positioning itself vis-a-vis other actors within South-South cooperation. So let me stop here, and if you have any question, Manya and I will be glad to answer.